So right off the bat, I'm going to turn the environment life back off real quick. We're definitely going to come back to this, but for now, I want to go back to the distant light while we work out some of these things. So the mantra settings then. There's a lot over here under the rendering tab specifically. Well, we don't need motion blur. I guess I could have had that off, but that's definitely not the worst offender. So let's actually start with that being off as a good baseline. So when we rendered the direct light before, it took 1 minute and 20 seconds. And now we're going to render it again, and let's see how long that ends up taking without the motion blur on. Not that we could see much motion blur anyway, because there wasn't really much velocity to speak of, but just so all things being equal, let's see what we get. And there we are, and as we can see, it's basically the same. 1 minute 19 seconds now as opposed to 120. I mean, that's effectively the same thing. We saved a second. I couldn't even tell you if that's because of the motion blur being turned off or what. In any case, so it takes about 1 minute and 20. Now, here are the main settings here. Now, the number one thing is pixel samples, and that's why it's the first on the list here. 3x3 basically means three samples in the X direction and three samples in the Y direction. When are those samples happening? Well, every single pixel in the image, we're sending out rays from the camera through that pixel. What does it mean? It means that it's going to kind of divide every pixel into 9 3x3 subpixels and send rays through each of those subpixels instead of just through the main pixel. And that alone will really speed things up as it comes down. Now, 1x1 is just too low. It's simply too low, and it's going to look like, well, it's going to look real bad. But you'll see how fast it goes. Look how fast that goes. Wow. Crazy. I mean, it's almost done already. I don't even need to pause this one. Boom. Done. 14 seconds. All the way done. And so there's the difference. You can really see the difference. It jumped up to 1 minute 20 from 14 seconds. I mean, that is, what's that? 5 times as much, just about 5 to 6 times as much time. You could use this. I mean, you can still get a vague sense of lighting and shadows in this mode. And you'll see once we go to 2 and 2, we've quadrupled the amount of samples. So we went from 1x1, which is 1, to 2x2, which is 4. And you'll see immediately how much smoother it gets. And that's what we want, of course. We want it to not be grainy. As these grainy dots are going to fly around everywhere from frame to frame, too. They're not just going to stay in the same place. Although, not that you ever really need this setting. If you click sample lock, it will actually keep these grainy things in the same spot, which is kind of weird. But anyway, you'll never need to do that. Except for debugging, maybe. So you can see how much clearer it got, and we already know that the third 3x3 looks like this as opposed to this. And so on and so forth. Now, these control what are called primary rays, and I'm going to put it back to 3x3. The primary rays are the rays that fly out of the camera into the scene and do the ray marching. So if we have some sort of ray coming out in this direction, so it's flying through the scene and it reaches into, imagine this red dot here at the end is the ray. So as soon as it hits the volume, it's flying through the air and it's like nothing here, nothing here, nothing here, nothing here, nothing here. And then, oh, we hit the volume. Send a secondary ray. Now we're going to talk about secondary rays a lot. It's going to send a secondary ray to the light. So here's, for example, the spotlight. Well, no, let's use the distant light. So we have a secondary ray goes from where we hit our volume, right here, or it hits the volume, it's going to send a ray in the direction of the light. It's going to go out that direction. And it's going to see, hey, do we hit any occluding objects, like maybe a tree is in the way, or a building's in the way, or a character's in the way? And if it does, oh, we're in shadow. So it'll know to color that relative to that. If it didn't, well, then maybe it'll receive full illumination. Now, the thing is, volumes being semi-transparent and, well, volumetric, as we get into it, we will need to take more samples. It's not enough to just sample the surface as if it was a solid object. It'll need to march in a certain distance, do another sample, and look, once we get deeper into this volume, it will actually have to travel through some density to get out to the light. So it's going to be self-shadowed, if only because of that. And of course, as we get deeper and deeper, there'll be more and more self-shadowing. And that's where the shadows on this volume are coming from. They're not coming from any other object in the scene. They're coming from itself, occluding light coming from that. And that's how that's determined, is again, ray marching. Sample, 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 sample. That's what takes up the bulk of your render. It's not the primary ray hitting it. It's the fact that it's got to do secondary rays coming out at every single ray march distance in. And that's what adds up fast. Because of course it's doing that times every pixel. And then when you're asking for 9 subsamples in the first place, you can see how it gets out of hand. So let's get into the rest of these settings then. Min ray samples and max ray samples. Really should say min secondary ray samples and max secondary ray samples. And you'll see that in the actual tooltip text here. It talks about the secondary rays. Now, it's going to do 1 by default, and it's going to do 9 by maximum. Now, how does it determine how many of these to choose? Like, why not just always do 1? Well, what it's going to do is it's going to say, well, when we sent out 9 subpixel samples in, did they mostly come back the same color? If they mostly came back the same color, it'll stick towards doing 1 secondary ray each. But if it's already noticing deviation, a high amount of deviation, it will start skewing towards the maximum, because it's going to know that it needs more to get a more accurate color. And this noise level parameter is actually what determines that. This is kind of the threshold of the deviation between the pixel samples. Meaning, again, if the noise level is 0, that means that if it ever has anything slightly different amongst the earlier samples, then we definitely need more samples. Put another way, this is the acceptable amount of noise that's acceptable in that image. So this is noise. When I say noise in this case, I'm not talking about a pattern of noise to texture something in a cool way. I'm talking about all this grainy nonsense. And you see it even in here. You'll notice all this. This shouldn't be here either. It's certainly less of it here when we had 3x3. There's more of it in the 2x2. These are rendering artifacts, and they're not what we want. So again, if I had, the higher this noise level gets, this is the main takeaway, is the higher you can push this number, the more noise is acceptable to be in your image. And the practical result of that is, it doesn't start pushing for the higher amount of secondary rays until this is exceeded. So by making this a high number, it will tend to not exceed that. It will allow for greater deviation in pixel samples. And then by allowing there to be more noise, it won't need as many secondary rays. And if there's not as many secondary rays, it can render faster. So that's a long way of saying the higher you can push that noise level, the faster it will be allowed to render, because it won't need to do as many rays. Now you could just cap this at 1 and then it won't matter. Then it's only ever going to do 1 secondary ray. But it's worth noting, this is 1 secondary ray per ray march. So when you're using something like a distant light or a spotlight, that's actually not going to do anything. It's going to do a lot with our environment light, which is good, because the environment light we really want to use. It looks good. But the secondary ray, so again, as the ray starts, so here it is again, meeting the volume. When it gets to here, it still has to do these ray marches every certain fixed distance. And we'll talk about exactly how far that distance is in a hot second. But anyway, when the ray march reaches here, it still has to send at least one secondary ray out to each of the lights. So that's why you can't go below 1. Even the maximum, you can't go below 1. The minimum can't go below 1. So you're always going to get that. So changing things like noise level and min-max ray sample is not going to actually change anything. I'm going to put this to do an absurd number, 1, and also just to drive the point home of making these all 1. So it, even if you somehow exceeded the noise level of 1, it still wouldn't be able to do anything more than 1 ray. And you'll see here that this is still going to probably, hopefully it doesn't make a liar out of me, this is still going to clock in at about 1 minute 20 seconds. I put this back to 3 and 3, so we're aiming for this picture now. So let's see. All right, and as predicted, it ended up at 1 minute and 18 seconds, which is more or less the 1 minute 19 seconds before. And if you see if he's skipping back and forth between the two, they're identical. So even though we crushed the amount of secondary rays it could do, and we also redundantly pushed this up. I mean, again, the noise level being exceeded will trigger the more ray samples, which we capped at 1 anyway. But just to illustrate, even though we put these insanely aggressive numbers on, it actually didn't lower our time at all because it has to do at least 1 secondary ray anyway per light. It will. Why I even explain it? Well, because again, the environment light, things that where it has to send out lots of rays, because it's not just coming from one point, from one direction in space. It's coming from all over the place. It has to send out multiple rays to see that.